A very pleasant evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's Jewish History Time, and when it's Jewish History Time on Nintendo, you got a great game. We're here to do a recap of the Napoleonic/Age of Revolution, but before we do that, I want to announce that I'm going to be taking another break. As you watch this, assuming you're watching it when it comes out, I'm doing some extensive traveling, and that's going to keep me occupied for about a month. However, that isn't to say that there won't be any content coming out while I'm gone. It's just that there won't be any of the regular, standard type of videos coming out for a while. Now, let's get into it. So first, a minor correction. Chabad was not the only Jewish group that opposed Napoleon's invasion of Russia, but it might as well have been. There were a handful of other Hasidic groups that mobilized in support of Alexander, but you have to remember that Hasidism at this point had firmly settled into very small, insular dynasties, whereas Chabad stood out by continuing to participate in mainstream society and was thus a lot bigger and more widespread. Gaon-level patron Jeffrey Schweitzer asks, I have heard that most Jews did not have family surnames until emancipation, and have heard many different stories about how those names were chosen. Would be interested in knowing more about that. So, I would disagree with the premise that the requirement for Jews to take permanent surnames was tied to emancipation, because it factually wasn't. In France, for example, the requirement for Jews to have surnames came in 1808, 17 years after full Jewish emancipation, while in Russia, Jews were required to take surnames in 1804, but weren't emancipated until 1917. By the way, Russia was not the last country in Europe to emancipate Jews. What we're dealing with here are two societal trends which often coincided, but weren't intrinsically connected. Emancipation is tied into the emergence of representative government, democracy, human rights, the social contract. Whereas the surname requirement is all to do with technology and industrialization and the need to have comprehensive data. To be perfectly clear, government mandates to have surnames were not exclusive to Jews. Or if they did pass decrees specific to Jews, like Napoleon did, and like Alexander did, general surname requirements weren't far behind. And Jews adopted surnames just like everyone else did. Many people already had them, especially if they were fairly wealthy or educated and wanted to trade on their family's reputation. If you look at the list of participants in Napoleon's Sanhedrin, you'll see that all of them already had surnames. Specific to Judaism, some of these surnames can go back to ancient times, like Cohen, Katz, Levi, Segel, or even more obscure ones like Gabai or Haddad. Adolphe Crémieux's name, Crémieux, is just a Frenchified version of the Hebrew Carmi, which means my vineyard. Others came out of the medieval or early modern periods, like Montefiore, but once surnames became a requirement, people took on occupational names, place names, sometimes just physical characteristics of the person who adopted it, or even just colors like black, white, red, green. Those seem to be the most common. I have both red and black in my family history. What made Napoleon's surname requirements unique in this regard is that he did not allow Jews in his empire to adopt names based on place names or based on names from the Bible. I can't say why, but I suspect he worried about ending up with too many people who all had the same names. So occupational names were the most common for Jews in France. Navi-level patron Osher Gordon asks, why was the Sephardic accent considered more modern and westernized if Sephardic Jews predominantly lived in the Ottoman Empire to the east? Is it related to Ben Yehuda's reason for standardizing modern Hebrew using the Sephardic accent because of its small sound inventory? So, for those not in the know, this is relating to something that I talked about in my recap of the post-Alhambra Decree pre-Enlightenment series. I'll put up a little link to that. Anyway, it's worth remembering that Sephardic Jews at this time also dominated the Jewish communities of the Netherlands, Tuscany, Great Britain, the US, the Caribbean, even Hamburg, right in Germany. So to an Ashkenazi Jew in Western Europe, Sephardim brought up images of Jews who were emancipated, educated, wealthy, people who had successfully adopted modern Western culture. As a result, Sephardic Hebrew became the prestige dialect for Maskilim in Europe. I myself went to a Reform synagogue as a child where I was taught to speak with a Sephardic accent. In fact, the first time I ever heard someone speak Hebrew with an Ashkenazi accent was the grandpa on Rugrats. And I remember being completely blindsided by it because it sounded ridiculous. Hello, I'm part of the problem. And that it was the prestige dialect in the 19th century was certainly one of the reasons that Eliezer ben Yehuda set it as the standard dialect when Hebrew was revived. The fact that it had the smallest sound inventory, as I've said before, is another. But there was also a third reason, and really an obvious one, which is that it was the dialect already being spoken in Palestine, and had been since the Safed era. Remember, people may not have spoken Hebrew natively, but they were speaking it fluently. In fact, it was the Safed circle that kind of led the transition from medieval Hebrew to early modern Hebrew. So by the time Ben Yehuda came along, the Sephardic accent was already the obvious, sensible choice on basically every level. It wasn't a terribly momentous decision on his part. Gaon-level patron Baxter Williams asks, "You mentioned it briefly, but what was the impact of reform on the lives of ordinary folks? Sure, debating the minutiae is Talmudic, but what real difference did it make in people's lives?" I don't think we've ever discussed this, but I'm going to guess from the nature of this question that you aren't Jewish. Because if you find yourself in a Jewish community where Reform Judaism doesn't exist, like in Israel, the divergence in just the basic way of life between orthodoxy and secularism is so dramatic that it's an enormous challenge for people just to make the transition, to the point that we have specific terms to describe people who do. Someone who is raised religious and becomes secular is datlash, and someone who is raised secular and becomes religious is bal tshuva. And the number of people going in each direction is about the same. Like, I've said this before and I'll say it again, the majority of the world's Jews today are not religious, and this is why. Conforming to Jewish orthodoxy affects what you eat, what you wear, the dishes in your house, what you can or can't do at certain times of the day and certain times of the week. It'll affect what time you get up in the morning. So you really have to feel the pull of spiritual fulfillment to make that commitment. And conversely, people who leave the tradition often have a very hard time adjusting as well. What Reform Judaism did was bridge that gap. The loosening of the orthodoxy not only made it easier for those who were already religious to function in a modern society as citizens surrounded by non-Jews, it also made it comfortable for people who had that spiritual inclination but couldn't handle the burden of an orthodox way of life to have a place to make sense of themselves in their community. One of the interesting things is that when Reform Judaism came to America, it didn't really have that effect so much as it validated the way Jews had already been living there for over a century. Because there were so few Jews in the US at the time, there was no religious infrastructure, no rabbis, no kosher butchers, nothing like that that could support an Orthodox way of life. So Reform Judaism wasn't just a natural fit for American Jews, but it provided a coherent ideology that justified the way they were already doing things. And for a lot of reformists in Europe, America kind of became the model for how this would be able to work. We'll talk more about this soon, but the closest the US ever came to establishing a national rabbinical court system like most other countries, it was going to be a Reform Jewish rabbinate. But we'll leave that to another time. Minor correction, replacement theology is also called supersessionism, not suppressionism. Honestly, yeah, that makes a lot more sense. And a minor clarification, the Muhammad Sharif Pasha who helped Rati Menton investigate the Damascus Affair is not the same Muhammad Sharif Pasha who later became Prime Minister of Egypt. That Muhammad Sharif Pasha was only 14 years old at the time and growing up in Europe. So when it came to covering the Damascus Affair, I decided to contextualize it with the very immediate geopolitical situation that both caused it to happen and also brought it to an end. However, the affair kind of existed at the nexus of a whole bunch of cultural and political trends going on in Europe and the Mediterranean. The one that most people brought up to me in the lead up to the video was the very sudden rise of anti-Semitic incidents, mostly of violence, in various parts of the Muslim world at the time. In 1831, Daoud Pasha, who was the breakaway leader of Iraq, exiled his Jewish ministers and incited pogroms against Jewish communities. Actually, stay tuned for an upcoming episode of Jewish History on the Plate, which actually connects to that. In 1834, there was the execution of Sol Hagoel, a teenage girl who was executed for apostasy because she converted to Islam and then went back to Judaism. And there were the pogroms in Iran, which I talked about in my special on Iran. And another thing that was going on, particularly in France, but not exclusively, was the phenomenon of La Belle Juive, which was basically an artistic movement to fetishize and exoticize Jewish women, which has never totally gone away. Even in the US, my own mother in her younger days was seen as something of a Belle Juive. And ironically, the Belle Juive aesthetic has recently been reclaimed by Jews as an affirmation of our Asianness, which is something I myself have engaged in. My thumbnail art from the Judean Tetrarchy episode is taken from a French Orientalist painting of Princess Shlomit. But neither of these trends seem to impact the affair directly, so I didn't feel comfortable including them, especially with the video already being so long. One more omission, and it's more of a fun one. When Adolphe Thiers was seeming to threaten the other European powers with, starting a world war, he commissioned the construction of a huge new defensive wall around Paris. And ironically, it didn't start construction until after he resigned, even though the crisis was fully over. Well, that wall, which was called the Thiers Wall, was demolished in the 1920s, but it is still the kind of parkway-ish modern border of the city of Paris. So if you want to know why Paris is the size and shape that it is, it's because of the events of this video. Now, some of you more eagle-eyed viewers may have noticed that there was one place where Jewish crown schools were operating that wasn't in the Pale of Settlement, and that was Courland, which is what we now call Latvia. And some people were asking, wasn't Courland part of the Pale of Settlement? And the answer is no. Like Congress Poland, Jews were allowed to remain in Courland without the same level of restrictions as in the Pale. However, those freedoms did not apply to new Jews who arrived in Courland from the Pale. So most Jews living in Courland were effectively illegal immigrants within the same country, which is why the education system effectively treated it as part of the Pale. Another place that was treated similarly was the Caucasus, which had been recently annexed by Russia from the Persian Empire, and also had a very large Jewish population with close ties to Persia and Iraq, and were more or less left to their own devices. Russian politics has always focused more on European policy. Even when they were expanding eastward, it was because of the politics of the West. Now for an omission. There were technically more than 9 Jewish officers in the Imperial Russian military. However, those were medical officers and aren't typically counted because their medical degrees categorized them as useful Jews, and thus they weren't required to go through the normal military process. I didn't get into this in the video, but as part of his regulations on Jews, Nikolai divided the population into useful and non-useful categories. Useful Jews were those whose skills were needed outside the Pale, mainly doctors, and was extended to include those who had completed their 25 years of military service. And what Alexander II did was to greatly widen the category of useful Jews to include anyone with a secondary education, artisans, merchants, and manufacturers. Even so, it's notable that the number of Jews who lived outside the Pale at this time was remarkably small, which really shows how concentrated the wealth of the Jewish population had become since the Polish era. Something that I did not intend, but sort of became a running theme more and more through each video of this run, was the looming specter of class warfare within the Jewish community, which of course more or less peaked with the Britain video. And when that did happen, I said that there started to be Jewish communities in Moscow and St. Petersburg and Siberia to a lesser extent. But there also began to be communities of so-called useful Jews in Udmurtia and Tatarstan, which were notable for existing, but again, very small. There was also an abortive attempt to resettle Jews in Siberia in 1835 under Nikolai, but this was quickly abandoned and the Jews were sent back west. Gaon-level patron Neve Tal asks, I can see why the Mitnagdim would oppose the Haskalah movement, but why did the Hasidim end up siding with the Mitnagdim? As a movement that is built on a rejection of the outdated and corrupt rabbinical system that the Mitnagdim probably represented in their eyes, and supporting more radical interpretations of Judaism, why was the Haskalah, which in a way also opposed the same outdated systems, the side that they ended up seeing as the greater evil, bigger than their arch enemies, the Mitnagdim? Okay. While both the Hasidim and Maskilim originated as political and spiritual rejections of the, as you say, outdated and corrupt rabbinical system, they really had fundamentally different goals. With the exception of Chabad, though they were going through some of their own weirdness under the Tzemach Tzedek, which is why he ended up being the face of Haredi opposition, Hasidim were all about feeling and gaining sort of inner spirituality, and was not terribly concerned about temporal matters. The Maskilim, on the other hand, were very much interested in renewing feeling and spiritual sensation, but they were also all about temporal matters. It was pretty much their entire reason for existing. We have to be careful when we hear the term assimilationist at this time, because Maskilim, even Reform Jews, didn't believe in assimilation in the sense of abandoning Jewish identity. Their idea of assimilation was to reconcile Jewish identity with the modern nation-state. And ultimately, Maskilim, at least in places like Galicia, where they lived in the same communities as Hasidim, actively sought to antagonize the Hasidim, to publicly disassociate from them, seeing them as a medieval response to modernity and saying, hey, we're not with them. Many episodes ago, I mentioned Joseph Perel, who was raised as a Hasid before becoming a Maskil, and he was very much leading the charge in that regard. Minor correction, the Act of Union between Great Britain and Ireland went into effect in 1801, and I called it the 1801 Act of Union, but the bill that was actually the Act of Union passed in 1800. Not a very big deal. Gaon-level patron Almogs9 asks, in your last video you mentioned that the British Parliament picked sides on many unrelated issues that were in their minds related. What were the sides and what issues did they pick? What other political stances has the pro-emancipation side taken? So, this patron is Israeli, and it occurred to me reading the question that I, as a native of the English-speaking world, never actually explained the differences between the political parties at this time, in the incorrect assumption that people were already familiar with them. Basically, the Conservatives, formerly the Tories, had been the party to uphold the interests of the rural, agrarian upper class, while the Whigs were the Liberals, and they represented the emerging industrial sector, the financial sector, cities, less feudal, less mercantile, more capitalist, middle class. And the Radicals were basically proto-socialists and represented the interests of small business owners and industrial workers, which is why there were so few of them in Parliament, since hardly any of those people even had the right to vote until the 1860s because of property and income requirements for voting at the time. For most of the 18th century, the Whigs completely dominated Parliament, but starting with the American Revolution and continuing through the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, the Conservatives dominated, to the point that by the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there was this huge backlog of political causes like slavery, voting rights, religious toleration, that had basically gone unaddressed for 40 years despite huge shifts in public opinion. And the UK came very close to having a full-on French-style revolution as soon as Napoleon was defeated. So when the Whigs finally came back to power in the 1830s, that's what the Great Reform was. It was going through and addressing all of these lingering issues. So Jewish emancipation was tied to the reform. But unlike those other issues, the conservative lords refused to back down on it because they had the support of the king. And if you want to know why, you'll just have to go back in time and ask him. The thing is, and I didn't have time to include it in the video, is that Disraeli recognized early on that there was a huge groundswell of public support for all of the reform initiatives, but that this wasn't translating into the way people were voting in elections. When he first ran for parliament, he was a member of the Radical Party. But there was a perception that conservative politicians had an inherent credibility that the Whigs and the Radicals didn't. So what he ended up doing was to join the Conservatives in order to advance liberal policies. And that was his entire governing philosophy. So as he rose the ranks and gained influence, he significantly narrowed the ideological gap between the parties, which is part of what brought this deadlock over Jewish emancipation to an end. When Jewish emancipation was finally passed in 1858, it was passed under a conservative prime minister. Disraeli, in fact, was basically the guy who was second in command in that government and was able to build a coalition by attracting some of the liberals into supporting him. And you can see this pattern all over the world. And that is the Age of Revolution. Stay tuned for the Age of Nationalism after the break, starting with a story that I have been waiting to tell since I started making these videos 3 years ago. Special thanks to my patrons Mir Akbar Ali, Jeremy Biskin, Boris Cherny, FC, Jay Fleischman, Osha Gordon, Serhiy Herasimov, Bob Huddy, Raphael Kellerman, Eric Liederman, and have a great summer.